Good morning, everyone. Just as Western civilization is composed of many elements, so has its capacity to run down a number of tracks. It goes without saying that some tracks are far better than others, and that many of these tracks are to be avoided at all costs. That such should be the case should not surprise us when we consider the variety of inheritances that are included in the Western tradition, ranging from the democratic Athens to militaristic Sparta and Rome, a Rome that was renowned for both its law and its gladiatorial games, to Christianity and Judaism. Now, we all want to think that Western civilization is a good thing, that it exerts a positive moral influence and by and large benefits humanity. But when we come down to it, the Western civilization of which we speak is invariably the English one. There are still souls about who, like Hegel, believe that Prussia was the goal towards which the geist of humanity strove, but they are rare these days. The cult of Kultur and of aristocratic militarism has lost its allure for obvious reasons. Many of the icons of Western civilization in its most positive expression, ranging from science to the rule of law, to toleration, to parliamentary government, to an appreciation of the importance of commerce, found their first expression in England. This was an England, by and large, that emerged in the late 17th and early 18th century, the England that so impressed Voltaire in his letters on the English. It was the glorious revolution of 1688 that created the English version of Western civilization, the version that we now generally invoke when we speak about Western civilization. By the glorious revolution, I do not mean simply what happened in late 1688 and early 1689 with the deposition of James II and his replacement by William and Mary, but following Steve Pincus, a whole series of changes can be identified, some of which were already in train before 1688 and some of which unfolded in the 1690s and beyond. Changes that included the following: the establishment of regular sittings of Parliament and of elections to be held for Parliament every 3 years, the creation of the Bank of England and of mechanisms for funding public debt that are sometimes described as the financial revolution, the establishment of the principle that the monarch does not possess a prerogative to overrule the laws of the country as determined by Parliament, with the lapsing of the Licensing Act, the creation of a free press and publishing industry, allowance of freedom for worship for dissenters, and the establishment of many other things such as copyright. There can be no doubt that the revolution in this broader sense laid the foundations for a Britain, as it became after the Act of Union in 1707, to become not just a free society, but also a powerful state that was able to bring prosperity to its people. The glorious revolution created the social and economic infrastructure that made the Industrial Revolution possible. It provided the set of institutions that enabled Britain not only to compete with her more populous neighbour France, but also consistently to defeat France in the wars of the next century. There are thus two aspects of the Glorious Revolution. The first is that Britain came to be identified with what has been termed the moderate Enlightenment. In England and Scotland, the advocates of science and rationality did not adopt a vehement hatred of religion, nor did they seek to overthrow the monarchy. British culture welcomed the progress of science, acknowledged that British political institutions were both monarchical and republican, and viewed itself as having steered a judicious course between the twin perils of superstition and fanaticism. The second is the way in which the English themselves attempted to downplay the revolutionary nature of 1688 and to emphasise the continuity of English history. This can be seen in the way that Edmund Burke sought to contrast 1689 and 1789. For Burke, the Glorious Revolution stood for building on existing foundations, and the French Revolution for tearing down the foundations and attempting to start anew. However, Burke did not create this analysis. It was built on an established English understanding of their revolution. It has recently been argued by Steve Pincus that 1688 was in fact quite revolutionary. Pincus points to an amount of popular violence. He wants to counter the case the revolution was just a coup d'etat or the consequence of William's invasion. It stirred up both popular support in favour and a measure of resistance from those supporting James. Most certainly, there was a full-scale civil war fought out in Ireland. But the amount of violence associated with the events of 1688 is really beside the point. What really matters is the framework within which the revolution occurred and the outcome that it achieved. Here, the English desire to minimise the amount of change that occurred is crucial. Yes, one can find abstract ideas from Locke and from a doctrine of resistance to justify the revolution. However, one can also find arguments that the revolution restored the ancient constitution and brought England back to its true system of government. Consequently, the line of argument that eventually won the day, that the revolution was essentially about continuity, is, I think, correct. A comparison can be made with the French Revolution. Francois Furet has argued that in 1788 there was considerable discussion in France that was conducted in historical terms about the established rights of Frenchmen. In 1789, however, a decisive break was made as the revolutionaries argued that the old France needed to be thrown away and a new France built from scratch. The whole institutional structure of France was to be made anew. This included not just the political structure, but also the church, the law, education, and social welfare. It was an extraordinary, ambitious program, and Burke immediately recognised its flaws. These included the fact that it unleashed upon the French a combination of provincial attorneys, hack journalists, and adventurers who did not understand about the reality of exercising power, and whose minds were enslaved to the abstract ideas of the radical Enlightenment. France embarked on a journey that led to the Terror. It also led to a two-century split between Catholic France and Republican France, to a France in the 1930s that was split between right and left, and hence to Vichy. Liberty, equality and fraternity stood opposed to work, family and nation. Of course, it can be argued that the Glorious Revolution split both Britain and its church. There were Jacobite uprisings in 1715 and 1745, and they were serious. There were non-jurors who left the Church of England. Nevertheless, the wounds created by that revolution healed, and they healed because of its moderate nature. The revolution consolidated a nation that was religious, commercial, and proud of the liberty that its political and legal system protected. One very important aspect of this outcome was that Britain did not alienate its intellectual classes in the same way that France and other continental countries did. Alienated by their society, the philosophes, the practitioners of the radical Enlightenment, were the first intellectuals of the modern world. Beneath them stood the literary hacks and pornographers of Grub Street with their venomous and vitriolic slanders and libels. This standoff between intellectuals and mainstream is a curse of the modern world, and a legacy largely bequeathed to it by the radical Enlightenment. From it stems all the radical movements of the 20th century, from fascism to communism, which almost destroyed Western civilization. But the English for a long time managed to avoid this curse. The Glorious Revolution was the first and last good revolution of the modern world because it enabled England to achieve a relatively smooth transition to a free, commercial and tolerant society. All of those features that we recognise as representing the best in Western civilization. I believe it is important to understand that the road that England took was not the only possible one, and that things may have turned out differently. Pincus argues that the reforms that James II attempted after he came to the throne in 1685 were an attempt to create an alternate form of modernity, one based on the ideal of a Catholic model exemplified by Louis XIV. It is also worth noting that Pincus also argues that it was a model specific to Louis XIV France, and that there were Catholics that opposed it. According to Pincus, the Glorious Revolution involved the victory of one version of modernity over another version, rather than the new and progressive over the old and traditional. It was more than just the triumph of a limited parliamentary monarchy over an absolutist form of government. It involved both ideas about religion and political economy. James supported a statist approach to economics that emphasised the primacy of land and agriculture, while the triumphant Whigs favoured an approach that allowed for the development of manufacturing and commerce through such means as the Bank of England. James sought to mould England in an essentially authoritarian and patriarchal fashion, and he may well have succeeded. He was largely building on changes that had occurred in England since his brother Charles II following the Restoration in 1660. J.C.D. Clarke has argued that 18th century English society was not as awash with Whiggish values as we might like to believe. In fact, modern Britain has never been just devoted to liberal values. However, had James II prevailed, it is certain that England would not have become the place that it did become. The Revolution galvanised forces devoted to liberty. It allowed the creation of a political order that combined representative institutions with a strong state. This combination was the foundation of modern Britain. In the history of Europe, only Britain achieved this combination in a smooth and natural way. The Parliament was accountable to the people who elected it. They were willing both to pay taxation to support the government and to lend money to it for its activities. Through the national debt, the government was able to raise money and to turn over the debt. This meant that the British state could maintain its credit rating and hence borrow at a relatively cheap rate. Britain also maintained a relatively efficient bureaucracy, combined with active involvement of local notables in local affairs. This was in contrast to France, which lacked representative institutions and hence accountability. On occasions in the 18th century, France went bankrupt. In fact, countries often went bankrupt in the pre-modern world, so if Greece goes bankrupt, it goes back to early examples. It was a credit risk, and this made its borrowing more expensive. The Revolution of 1789 occurred because of a crisis in French finances and political institutions. France also lacked much liberty, which is why both Voltaire and Montesquieu looked so favourably towards England. There was another model in Europe, that exemplified by Prussia. Prussia had very little in the way of representative institutions, but it did have a powerful and efficient bureaucracy and army. It was a leader in the introduction of education for its people, but it was not a place devoted to liberty. Rather, as a model of what is known as the police state, it treated its people as population to be used for the benefit of the state, to strengthen the state, and to make it prosperous and militarily powerful. One can see that both the French and Prussian models of modernity ran into serious problems. For France, it began with the Revolution and ran for the next 2 centuries. In Prussia, it led to a type of society that honoured culture and provided benefits for its people, but which was careless in its appreciation of the value of liberty. Only in England did a society emerge that sought to combine liberty and authority, personal freedom and a strong state. Almost alone in the 1930s, the English-speaking world remained immune to the allures of fascism. Much of this can be traced back to the Glorious Revolution and the fact that it reinforced all that is best in the inheritance of Western civilisation. Whether by design or accident, the English and the British struck down this road. This is why, when we marvel at what we see as Western civilisation, we invariably mean the Anglophone version. The end.